TVO Podcast, Gibisin Danawa. You're listening to a TVO podcast. Sovereignty is the ability for a people to make their own decisions,
to speak and be heard.
For Indigenous people battling generations of colonization, we express our sovereignty in many different ways.
Through living our lives as our authentic Indigenous selves,
Through our leadership, stories, and teachings, and through our art.
join us, Chris Beaver and Shelby Lisk, on the art of sovereignty.
In each episode, we explore the history and lives of First Nations artists who would not let others define them.
They fought against the currents and used their work and their influence to break barriers and bring Indigenous perspectives to the forefront.
The following podcast mentions residential schools. The Indian Residential School Crisis Line is available 24 hours a day for anyone experiencing pain or distress as a result of their residential school experience. Call 1-800-721-0066. Please take care while listening. Chris Indishnikas, Mississauga Anishinaabe Ndao, Hamadushkadeang Ndunjaba no Gojiawang Deda. I'm Chris Beaver, and from TVO Podcasts, this is The Art of Sovereignty. In 1839, before Canada was a country, British Wesleyan missionaries started a manual labor school in what is now known as Alderville First Nation, my home reserve. It was one of the first boarding schools for Indigenous children in British North America. As the Fathers of Confederation were plotting Canada, a top concern was how to deal with the Indians. In 1847, Reverend Dr. Egerton Ryerson recommended manual labor schools as the best way to promote the moral, social, and intellectual improvement of the Indians. And the Indian residential school system was born. Generations later, my father was among the last students to attend Alderville's Indian School before it was shuttered in 1967. What started in Alderville was a blueprint for residential schools across the country. These schools were designed to kill the Indian in the child and taught them to hate their own cultures. Stripped of everything they once knew, many left the residential school system feeling lost in their homeland with no direction. Estranged from their communities and families with no sense of belonging anywhere.
I can think of the people who went to residential school and there was a blank part of them.
That's renowned Haida artist Robert Davidson. Davidson grew up in a small fishing village known as Masset, on the archipelago of Haida off the coast of British Columbia. Haida, which means Islands of the People, is his ancestral homeland. Davidson grew up at a time when the effects of colonization had devastated his people in many ways. Their population size, their environment, their language, their arts, their way of life, and their spirits.
I can't imagine what it was like when my dad came home from residential school and being ostracized because they didn't speak the language. They weren't allowed to speak the language. They learned English and their spirit was broken. It took my dad many years to accept being Haida. They were the generation that would be the link to my generation in terms of learning our history, our ceremonies, our songs, and many of them died very young.
Little did Davidson know that in the final hour of his fading heritage, history had chosen him to usher in a revival of Haida arts and culture. I spoke to Davidson by video chat from his studio in Samiamo First Nation near Vancouver, British Columbia. Davidson is in his mid-70s with tawny skin and a thick head of comb-back hair, white with remnants of jet black.
My hair is okay.
Wonderful. Looking good. His appearance reminded me of my father, as did his iPad struggles. Once we made digital contact, I could see him, but I couldn't hear him. Then we got his rear-facing camera turned on, giving me a nice glimpse of his beautiful studio. It had busy white walls displaying vibrant Haida paintings, wood-carved masks, and old photographs. The walls were offset by the warm tones of exposed beams, stacked firewood, workbenches, carving tools, and partially finished sculptures. I found Davidson pleasant and endearing, with an easy smile, a keen mind, and a kind manner. He's a great storyteller with an open and honest way of expressing himself. He was very generous with his time, and I loved every minute of it. Haida Gwaii is a group of over 200 islands off the northwest coast of British Columbia. It's known for beautiful landscapes, plentiful wildlife, and a rich cultural heritage. Previously known as the Queen Charlotte Islands, the name Haida Gwaii was reclaimed in 2010 for its original inhabitants. The Haida people have been there for more than 10,000 years. Before European contact, Haida civilization was flourishing, as was the biodiversity of their homeland. Their population was in the tens of thousands. By 1915, the Haida population had been reduced to 588 people, mostly due to diseases brought by Europeans. By the time of Robert Davidson's birth in 1946, the forests and waters of Haida Gwaii were being exploited by industry. The old-growth trees that were once destined to become iconic totem poles had been clear-cut. The Haida language and culture had become critically endangered. Davidson is one of the most respected and important contemporary artists in Canada. He's a Northwest Coast native of Haida and Tlingit descent. In a career spanning over 50 years, Davidson is a master in the tradition of his great-grandfather, the renowned Haida artist Charles Edenshaw. Haida art is of the Northwest Coast style that you seem to see everywhere these days. It was heavily featured at the Vancouver Winter Olympics. It's a staple of Canadian gift shops, and it's tattooed on the right bicep of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And he even has a Robert Davidson design. Haida art is carved or painted on wood, stone, argillite, or other materials, and often features animals and mythical beings. Argillite is a type of black slate only found on Haida Gwaii. Davidson is a master sculptor of totem poles and masks. Along with this, he's known for ceremonial arts, jewelry, painting, and prints. His craftsmanship and interpretation of traditional Haida form is second to none. He has produced numerous renowned masterpieces and received many honors, including the Order of Canada, the Order of British Columbia, the Audame Prize for Lifetime Achievement, the Governor General's Award, honorary doctorates, exhibitions, retrospectives, public and private commissions, and international acclaim.
My Haida name is Otsandlants, which translates to Eagle of the Dawn. I belong to the Chatlanus clan, which is Eagle. My mother is from Heidelberg, Alaska. My father is from Masset, British Columbia.
Davidson was born in Heidelberg, a town named after the Haida people. The Haida are an international tribe that mostly live in Masset and Skidegate on Haida Gwaii, British Columbia, and in Heidelberg, Alaska. Davidson's family moved to Masset when he was an infant. Growing up in Masset, Haida culture had been so oppressed that Davidson didn't even realize he was Indigenous.
You know, we were pretty isolated in Masset, and I didn't realize how much we were contained in that small reserve. Whenever there was a movie in the village, cowboy and Indian movies were the most popular. I remember we were always cheering the cowboys when they were attacking the Indians. They were always featured as the heroes. We were always featured as the bad people. One day my uncle pulled me aside, "Hey, Robert, did you know you're an Indian?" I cried. I literally cried. I didn't realize I was cheering for the bad people. The stories, they only showed the one side.
Having the ability to tell your own stories, to define your own worldview, is called narrative sovereignty. It means that you have the ability to share ideas that are important to you. When Indigenous people have narrative sovereignty, stereotypes and myths fall away, and we're free to truly represent ourselves. Old Western movies portrayed Indians as bloodthirsty savages, out to harm innocent white settlers, the target audience. Cowboys were the heroes, coming to save the day and protect white, civilized folks. The narratives were used to support and maintain the oppression of Indigenous peoples. The young Davidson unwittingly bought into the narrative and joined everyone else in the amusement of harming Indians, until he realized he was one. In that moment, he realized his own loss of narrative sovereignty.
I was brought up in a fishing village. The mainstay of the day was fishing and logging. The majority of the people in Masset were fishermen.
What was it like for Indigenous people here in Canada at the time when you were born?
There were laws against Native people hiring lawyers to settle the title question. We were bound by that law, so we couldn't really work to resolve that situation. And at the same time that we were muted and contained in this little reserve, the exploitation went rampant with the logging on Haida. For anybody who was non-Haida, they had to sign in to visit onto the reserve and sign out at sundown. And the same is said for the Haida people. We had to get approval from the Indian agent to leave the reserve. Those laws were binding. Because of that law, some people were enfranchised. They signed their Indian rights away so that they could leave the reserve. At that time, you couldn't go to bars, for example, or the liquor store. And so when you signed away your Native rights, you were allowed to vote. You were allowed to go beyond the reserve without having to sign in or sign out.
Are you saying that if you would give up your status as an Indigenous person, you were given more freedom?
Yeah, you were non-Haida after that. And that created a divide in the village. After the laws changed, there were several Haida members living in New Masset. They were actually ostracized because they signed their status away.
During this era, as part of a policy of assimilation, Indigenous cultural expression had been banned across Canada. People were actually getting arrested and going to jail for doing things like having a potlatch or dancing the wrong way. The potlatch is a ceremonial feast integral to the culture and traditions of many First Nations, including the Haida. Indigenous culture had to go underground to survive. The legal ban of Indigenous culture wasn't lifted until 1951, when Davidson was 5 years old.
My grandparents never ever sang in public. They were afraid because they would be arrested for doing our ceremonies. Cultural knowledge, history, was conveyed through Christmas dinners, weddings, funerals, picnics. They were under the guise of these celebrations.
How and when did you become an artist?
My dad insisted that I start carving when I was 13. That's in 1959. We have a strong belief in reincarnation. We call it hunts. You're reborn. And when I started carving, it was almost like a deja vu. My dad would carve one side of the miniature totem poles, and I would match what he carved. And when he wasn't able to help me, I would go and visit my grandfather.
In 1965, when Davidson was in grade 12, he had to move to Vancouver to finish high school.
When I came to Vancouver, that's when I first saw the great art done by the old masters. Up to that point, I didn't realize what an amazing artistic tradition that I came from. I didn't realize because there was absolutely nothing left. when I first started carving in 1959. Seeing the amazing art in the museums made me want to improve more. And then after high school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And the only way I knew how to make money was to carve. And so I just kept carving.
Davidson found support and mentorship along the way.
I met Bill Reed then, and he invited me to work in his studio.
Haida artist Bill Reed is considered to be one of the most significant Northwest Coast artists of the late 20th century. His impact on Davidson's work would be profound.
I did a lot of studying with Bill. I spent a lot of time looking at his totem poles. And also there was one totem pole still survived from the 1880s in Skidegate. And I spent a lot of time looking at that. Eventually, I worked on a small wooden totem pole with Bill so I could learn how to carve wood, because at that point I was only carving argillite. That was the year before I carved the pole in Masset.
In 1969, when Davidson was 22 years old, he carved his first totem pole for his community in Masset. A totem pole is a monumental carving and an iconic facet of Northwest Coast art. Symbols, faces, animals, and mythical beings are carved into the trunk of a large red cedar and then painted with vibrant colors. They were used to preserve stories, document histories, explore ideas, and commemorate families, people, or events. The Haida are credited with making some of the first totem poles in the world. Davidson's totem pole was called Mother Bear, and it was the first one raised in Haida Gwaii in almost 100 years. This singular event sparked a revival of Haida arts and culture. How did that journey begin for you?
One of the trips home, I went knocking on all the doors in the village to see if anybody had any of the old carvings left. And I found one box. I was really saddened by that.
Why was there nothing in Masset?
That had to do with the missionaries. The missionaries condemned who we were. They called us heathens. We were sinners. We were savages. There was no wanting to know who we were. They were so busy converting us to Christianity. And the missionaries made it sound that's the only way to go to heaven, is through following their ways. And in following their ways, many people turned their backs on the art. Because of the teachings, the doctrines of Christianity, I was brought up in that doctrine. I'm really happy that I had Nani Chinny.
He's talking about his grandparents. His relationship to his grandparents was significant. They were his main connection to his Haida culture.
They were torn between Christianity and our own philosophies. They wanted to go to heaven. All of them wanted to go to heaven. The missionaries encouraged us to cut down the totem poles because they thought that we were worshiping the totem poles. There's an elder who talked about being hired to cut the totem poles down. He said he wanted to go to heaven. So he went out and cut the totem poles down. And they sawed it up into firewood. I had this idea to carve a totem pole. And the idea was to have the elders celebrate one more time in the way that they knew how. That was my thinking. And I made that promise. But it took a couple of years before I was able to follow through with the promise. I had this really nice relationship with the elders. I really felt at home with them. I went to visit this one couple. I didn't realize they were having a church meeting. And they were all in the living room in this one big semicircle. I felt a real sadness with all of them. And I knew I had to do this totem pole. After I made the commitment, the doors kept opening for it to happen. My dad phoned me up one day and said, "Hey, Robert, I found your tree." I said, "Oh, wow." I never thought about getting the tree. And then the curator at UBC, the Museum of Anthropology, unbeknownst to me, applied for a $3,000 cultural grant to help me. And when I went home, Reg, my brother, after school joined. He was 14 years old. He never carved before. And there we are, carving a totem pole. The only question I had was, why am I doing it? And after a few weeks of thinking that, I said, okay, the answer will come later. And so I just knew what had to be done. It took Reg and I 3.5 months, the 40-foot totem pole. We were working 10, 12-hour days, 6 days a week, just carving away.
Davidson didn't realize this was a historic moment in the making. Word got around and the story got national attention. The day would be documented by the National Film Board of Canada, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and news outlets across the country. For the Haida, a totem pole raising is a ceremonious event, but even the oldest people in the community had never done this before, and they didn't have the traditional ceremonial objects. They fashioned headpieces from cardboard and gathered items, such as feathers from costumes. They even had to use toy drums. But nothing could stand in the way of this momentous occasion.
Everything happened from a cosmic memory. When in one of the meetings, Chinny told me, he said the head carver ties all his tools together and drapes it around his neck and chants, ha, 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 around the pole before it was to be raised. I remember being shy to do that, and I pretended to forget. But Chinny said, you have to do it. So I did that. The feeling was so amazing. It felt like I was in another world. The feeling of completion and breathing life into the totem pole.
What did you learn from this experience?
I learned that the art had a deeper meaning than just being beautiful, being well carved. I learned that the art was a catalyst to combine song and dance, to actually act it out and participate in that ceremony solidified that knowledge. The art tied ceremony to who we are. Immediately after the totem pole was raised and secured in the ground, the dancers automatically formed a big circle and sang. I was pretty naive. Thought I was teaching the old people something about our art. Little did I know how much depth was still retained, even though it wasn't being practiced. That knowledge was held in each one of them. In coming together, that knowledge was solid. Everybody sang together, danced together, and opened their hearts to wanting to learn more about who we were, who we are. And the laws that governed us had prevented that.
Davidson's coming of age as a Haida artist carried the weight of history. In the final breaths of his ancient culture, Davidson reconnected the chain of hereditary knowledge before all was lost. His actions revived Haida arts and culture. It's been 53 years since that historic day in Masset, and Davidson hasn't slowed down after all these years. If his early work was about the history of the traditional Haida arts and culture, his current work is about the vitality of the Haida visual language and bringing it into the future. So we've discussed your very first totem pole. Now let's talk about your most recent.
I did two variations. The first one is We Were Once Silenced. It's a 8-foot totem pole, and it's two heads, one on top and one on the bottom upside down. And the Argillite tradition, many of the Argillite pipes had beings tongue to tongue. Frog, tongue to tongue with eagle, raven, tongue to tongue with killer whale, and so on like that. So I used that idea. These two faces were tongue to tongue, but they were both sharing the same mouth. And underneath those tongues are two human faces, and they are sharing the same mouth. And that is us being muted by the colonial people. 10 years later, I carved another totem pole, Beyond Being Silenced. The very bottom is a grizzly bear, just the head part, sharing the same mouth as the eagle on top. The grizzly bear and eagle are tongue to tongue, and underneath are the same two people, but these two people are communicating with each other in relearning our history. And on the very bottom is grizzly bear upside down, and the eagle is our power. We're reclaiming our place. And on the very bottom, between the ears of the grizzly bear, is a frog. And I think of frog as spirit helper, my spirit helper.
Given that these are two political works about the historical treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada, I'm wondering what you think about the use of Northwest Coast art as a facet of Canadian identity.
Shutting and muting us for centuries, and at the same time using our imagery to attract tourism. It's almost a cosmic joke. But we are a forgiving people, and we embrace the idea. Even though the history is still muted, the burials, the unmarked graves, they call it newly discovered, but the people who went to those schools knew, but Canada denied that it happened. But now we have solid evidence.
I know you're concerned about the times we're living in, but I also sense your optimism. Where do you find hope?
You know, it was the art that pulled us out of that really dark period. And our stories and thoughts are the most powerful tool we have as human beings. When we start thinking dire thoughts, those thoughts are digging deeper holes. When I committed to carving the totem pole, those doors opened up. My dad said, I have your tree. And the curator applied for this grant. My grandparents were there. The village was ready for it. Those doors opened up. Even the weather opened up. It rained all summer. We were carving the pole. The day before the pole was to be raised, the sun came out. It shone that day of the pole raising, the next day, and then it started to rain again. I think collectively, our thoughts can turn this around.
To see the images referred to in this episode, check out the link in the show notes. The Art of Sovereignty is written and hosted by Chris Beaver and Shelby Lisk. Produced by Ozzie Michelin and Katie O'Connor. Edited by Chris Beaver with assistance from Matthew O'Mara. Laurie Few is the executive producer for digital at TVO. Music by Bed Tracks. We'd like to thank the artists and curators who made time to speak with us for the series. Production assistance from Jonathan Hallowell, Nikki Ashworth, and Albert Wisco. Special thanks to the Art Gallery of Peterborough, the Power Plant Gallery, Carleton University, and especially Wanda Nanabush and the Art Gallery of Ontario.